Hello everyone and welcome to another exciting talk from the Oxford Guild with our Collegium Global Network and our partner societies from leading universities. Today we're honoured to be hosting a special online event with our esteemed guest, Dr. Hermann Hauser, who is a truly renowned and decorated serial entrepreneur, scientist and venture capital investor, who is one of the fathers of the British tech industry. In 1978, he first founded Acorn Computers, which has been dubbed the British Apple, and was developer of the iconic BBC Micro. Their subsidiary, Arm Holdings, has grown into the UK's largest and most successful technology company, and was purchased in 2016 by SoftBank Group for £24 billion. Arm is the world's leading microprocessor technology supplier, and its designs are at the heart of nearly every smartphone. Dr. Hauser is also the co-founder and venture partner of Amadeus Capital Partners, a leading technology-focused venture capital fund. Amongst the many awards he has received, Dr. Hauser was awarded an honorary KBE for services to engineering and industry, and was also elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2012, and named by Eureka as one of the 100 most important scientists in the world. He continues to remain at the forefront of UK and global innovation as a major contributor to the international technology and growth agendas, and today he'll be sharing his insights, discussing the future of artificial intelligence, and answering your questions. We're all in for a real treat. Thank you very much again, Dr. Hauser, for taking the time to join us, and over to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk to you all via these wonderful video capabilities that have now come to the fore because of COVID. So maybe you could put up the first slide for me, please. Before we get the slides, maybe I'll just make a few comments on COVID, because you hear me talk from my farm in New Zealand, and we don't have any COVID cases in New Zealand at all. With the exception of the people that are locked up in quarantine hotels in Auckland when they come in by plane from the UK or India. So New Zealand and its politicians, in particular Jacinda Ardern, handled the crisis better than most countries in the world. And it rekindled my belief in Western democracies, that there are Western democracies with great leadership. You can actually have such a thing as a good leader does actually exist in Western democracies, despite what we see in the US and the UK. So Jacinda has shown that democracies can produce people that can lead through crises like this, and she's done a fantastic job basically eradicating the virus from a country. And we've had a total of 22 deaths in the whole country, and a total of 1,500 cases altogether. So it's a good example where you don't need to be a dictatorship to actually sort out a serious crisis like this. But let's start with my talk. The talk is about technology disruption in the US, Europe, and China. Next slide, please. So I just want to start off with a slide contrasting the US, China, and Europe, which are really the only three entities in the world that seem to matter. And one, as a passionate European, I'm just so sad and stunned that Britain was willing to give up the only seat it had at the top table. So let's have the next slide and see what characterizes the US now in this game of interruption and innovation. This is really the characteristic slide for the US. Out of the 10 top companies by market cap, 8 are from the US, 2 are from China, and now none are from Europe. And this financial power is still overwhelming, and the US dollar is still responsible for 60% of the world trade, although I think that will change rapidly over the next 5 years. And I'll talk a little bit about the initiative of the Chinese central bank with their digital currency, which I think will probably topple the dollar within the next 5 years. Next slide, please. So the next slide really shows is the iconic slide for China. If you just look at the growth rate of China, although it has slowed down a bit, it has just been the most spectacular event this century. At the beginning of the century, China was a minnow. It was the size of Britain. And now it has overtaken the US in terms of PPP GDP, the GDP measured by purchasing power parity, which is really the only measure that economists think matters, because it's the ability of a country to produce more products, more aircraft, more ships, more trains, because they're all produced locally. And that's why PPP is the right way of comparing countries. So on the next slide, we actually see the world's PPP ranking, which surprised me when I first saw it, because China is clearly number one already by purchasing power parity with 21 trillion. Interestingly, number two is Europe with 20 billion. Number three is the US with 80 trillion, and Japan 5. But here comes the sad story about Europe. Although Europe is number two in the world behind China, if you ask people who is the world's leading economic power, 42% will say the US, 32% will say China, and 9% would say Europe. So Europe really is punching so far below its weight. It's really quite sad, and we need to do something about that. Next slide, please. So what to do? Well, the main thing that we can do is build on our prowess in our research capabilities, our innovation, and look forward to building new industries rather than trying to compete with China on producing more Nike shoes. And there are 4 key innovations which I believe will change our lives within the next 5 to 10 years rather than 10 to 20 years. And these are artificial intelligence and machine learning, as I'm sure all of you know, because it's a horizontal technology, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Number 2 is blockchain and smart contracts. That might surprise some people, but because there's so much fraud going on with cryptocurrencies and ICOs, but the underlying technology is very, very impressive and will allow us to automate many business processes and make our economy a lot more efficient. The third one is synthetic biology, because we're basically beginning to understand the building blocks of life, synthetic genes in particular. So I'm very excited about that. And of course, we have investments in each of these sectors. And last but not least, as a physicist like myself, quantum computing has always been a great darling of the physicists. But like fusion, we always thought that was 30 years away. And 5 years ago, it became clear that it's not like fusion, that 30 years later, it's still 30 years ahead, but that within the next 5 years, we will have a quantum advantage. We already have quantum supremacy, which Google has shown last year, but quantum, which is something that a quantum computer can do that no classical computer can do, but it was something that was totally useless. So quantum advantage is for quantum computers to do something that a classical computer cannot do, but which is really useful. Next slide, please. So let's start with some observation on artificial intelligence and machine learning. So again, the 3 blocks are competing with each other. Every continent, every one of the big powers now has microprocessors in that case. And I'm delighted to say that one of our investments, actually a Bristol-based company called GraphCore, has a chance of producing, has produced the fastest machine learning microprocessor in the world, giving you 250 teraflops, which is a new record, with 7,000 processors on a single chip and a gigabyte of memory. So it's a very exciting development, and we're right there at the forefront with the US and China, although there is formidable competition there. An area where we're not doing so well in Europe is big data. All the big data seems to be gathering in the GAFA companies. That's Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. or Alibaba and Tencent, but we don't really have such an outstanding internet company in Europe. And but what we have done, which I think is very significant and is world leading, is we have GDPR. We have the General Data Protection regime that has been implemented in Europe, and I think it implements a basic principle which I'm very proud of, that Europe has taken the lead there, and that is that people own the data. It's not Google that owns our data, but we own our data, and therefore we as individuals ought to be able to decide what happens to that data. It also legitimizes the data used through various degrees of anonymization, which clearly can be incredibly helpful in areas like health, where you really want to have these big genomic databases or databases on illnesses to be able to correlate it with genomics, for example. I do believe that the concentration of data in companies like Google and Facebook is so monopolistic at the moment that they need to be broken up. And one of the failings of the US society, the way the US is organized, is that they seem to be incapable of breaking up their monopolies. Although the US, of course, was originally the organization that broke up Standard Oil. And the US showed us how to do this. And I'm very pleased to say that the European competition law is now a lot fiercer than the US ones. There is a wonderful book called The Great Reversal by Thomas Philippon, who is an MIT economics professor, who came up with an amazing set of data that I just didn't believe when I first read it. I read the whole book with, just finished it with great interest, because he basically said that US has given up on free markets. I said, what do you mean the US has given up on free markets? The US is the cradle of free markets, is the leader of free markets. How can that be true? Well, the answer is the people in the US pay up to 3 times as much for the internet access, because their lobbying system has allowed American telecoms companies to merge to such an extent that there are now so few companies left that there is a telecoms oligopoly, and they all make enormous profits and basically take it out on the consumers and charge them far too much. I said, well, that's maybe an exception. Not so. There are a number of sectors in the US that are a lot less competitive now than Europe. Airlines is another example. America invented low-cost airlines, but it is the European competition law that they copied from the Americans, but without the merger frenzy that has happened through the lobbying system in the US. They managed to convince Congress and the political system through, I mean, it's not quite corruption, but it's close to corruption, because the only way you get elected in the US is by, it costs a couple of billion to become president in the United States, and it costs a few million to become a senator. Now, who is going to provide that money? It's not individuals, it's the big companies. And of course, after the senator has been elected, or the House of Representatives, they then say, well, could you just allow that merger to go through? So there are now so few airlines in the US that they can pump up the prices, and they make, again, oligopoly profits, as opposed to European airlines that are much more competitive. And the inverse is true as well. The last thing that I would have thought is that he showed that the Brussels bureaucracy is actually incredibly efficient. Especially, at least in the competition law, because of the following interesting dynamics. When the competition commission was set up in Brussels, of course, all the big countries like Germany and France and Britain were trying to get a special deal. How can I get something that the others don't, as they always have in competition agreements. And because there were too many of them, that didn't work. So the dynamics then was, well, if I can't get it, let's make absolutely sure that the Germans don't get it, or the Brits don't get it, or the French don't get it. So we have a competition law that is the fiercest competition law of any of the three big economic areas in the world, which is a sort of surprising result. So, and my last point on AI is that AI and machine learning finally allows you to deal with very, very complex systems where we don't have good equations yet. You know, you don't have a Schrödinger equation or a Maxwell equation or anything like that for a complex thing like health and lots of other systems. Next slide, please. The second technology that I'm very excited about and I believe will change our lives within the next 5 to 10 years is the blockchain and smart contracts. Now the blockchain, I hope you can still hear me. The blockchain has a terrible reputation because of the cryptocurrencies and all the fraud and you know, money laundering that goes on through that. But that shouldn't distract from the basic soundness of the distributed ledger technology, which is a mathematically very, very sound way of having a relationship and processes between people that don't need to trust each other. And in my opinion, once we automate KYC and AML, that's know your customer and anti-money laundering, this area will take off big time. And good examples where I think this revolution will happen very quickly is payment systems. There's a lot of discussion about central bank digital currencies. The Bank of England is one of the leading contributors to this discussion. Mark Carney made a wonderful presentation at Jackson Hole about synthetic hegemonic currencies, where he argued, I think totally correctly, that the central banks in the world, or at least the Western world, ought to get together and produce such an e-currency because it makes payments so much more efficient, and it takes you know, a lot of friction out of the economy. Like you know, we all pay about 2% in our credit card now. Well, we don't. The merchant pays 2% in credit card fees, which is a 2% tax on every transaction, any consumer transaction in the world, which would be completely removed with e-currencies. So it's highly desirable to introduce these e-currencies. But as so often in the Western world and democratic systems, it's very slow and cumbersome. And although the Bank of England has been one of the leading contributors to the discussion, the Chinese are actually implementing it. So the Chinese central bank is now rolling out their e-yuan in 4 big cities in the US, in China, including Shenzhen. And I just read yesterday that Didi, the Uber of China, is now accepting the e-yuan for payment. As many of you will know, China has completely revolutionized their payment system with Alipay and WeChat Pay. They basically jumped over the credit card system and went to an electronic system that spread like wildfire. And in a very short time, all of China now uses Alipay and WeChat Pay. And there are many restaurants now that you can't even pay with anything else but Alipay. And I think the same thing will happen with the e-yuan. And it will, it is the biggest threat to the dollar, I think, because if a big central bank like the Chinese central bank stands behind an e-currency, it might become a global payment system also for larger transactions. There's also the possibility of having a big revolution in real estate, because you can have fractional ownerships with the blockchain and distributed ledger technology, and of course in insurance claim, where we have one of our investments in a company called Blockchain. But we need good regulation. This is the Wild West at the moment, and we need to make sure that people have the confidence in an e-currency that is not available with the Bitcoin at the moment. The big promise of the blockchain plus smart contracts. I think the smart contracts are equally important because you can automate business processes with this, and that will make our economy a lot more efficient because it gets rid of a lot of the paperwork. Next slide, please. So I come now to the third technology that I believe will be revolutionizing our lives within the next 5 to 10 years, and that is synthetic biology. We're finally beginning to understand how to not just sequence genes, and we were very fortunate to be one of the lead investors in Solexa, which was sold to Illumina and is now responsible for 90% of the gene sequencing in the world. And some of the same team members that helped me build Solexa into the great global success, it's a company worth 40 billion now, are now in another Cambridge startup called Evonetics doing gene synthesis. And I think gene synthesis long-term will be much more important than gene sequencing, because once you can synthesize genes in a base accurate way, then you take control of the basic building block of life. And there is a wonderful book by Max Tegmark, an MIT professor, called Life 3.0, which talks about the coming revolution in this space. The reason why he's called it Life 3.0 is that Life 1.0, in his opinion, was the sort of nematode worm that where both the hardware of the worm, the way the worm looks like, but also the behavior of the worm is completely determined by evolution. Life 2.0 is us, where our hardware at the moment, our bodies are still completely determined by evolution, but our software, our language, the way we behave, etc., is clearly learned from our parents and from society around us. And Life 3.0, he argues, is the period that will probably start, very soon, 5 to 10 years, where we also take control of our hardware by taking control of our genes. Now, the good news about that aspect is that it will cause a revolution in chemistry, of moving many of the chemical reactions that are very environmentally unfriendly, with very high temperatures, very acidic or alkaline environments, to a very benign environment, which is a biological fermentation environment. And it also makes it not only environmentally a lot friendlier, but also a lot cheaper and more efficient. It also can deal with the 8,000 monogenetic diseases that we have by just fixing the genes that are wrong and making sure that this doesn't happen again if you fix it in the germline. But of course, it also is a big danger, because if you take control of the genes, you then have enormous power of creating any living thing, and some that haven't ever existed before. So having good regulation, I think, is very important. And Britain has actually shown the way on how to do this in its world leading embryonic research council. And I think we need a similar regulation for synthetic biology, because we're basically taking control of a sector that we've not managed to control before, which is biology. The next slide, please. So the excitement about quantum computing is that classical computing, as all of you know, is all about zeros and ones. And zeros and ones have been suggestive of right and wrong. So it naturally led to a belief that we can describe the world in terms of a first order predicate calculus, that something is big or not big, or red or not red, or expensive or not expensive. As it turns out, trying to describe the world with the first order predicate calculus is a bad idea. It doesn't work very well. The only proper way of describing the world is with probabilities. And that is really that changeover from a binary classification of properties to a probabilistic description of properties of the world is the secret behind the phenomenal success that we've had with AI and machine learning. And in many ways, it is built into quantum computers with qubits, because qubits are not either zeros and ones like in the binary system, but they are a mixture of both. So the intrinsic aspect of quantum computing in general, and the Schrödinger equation is, of course, the classic example of that, is that it's all about probabilities. That the fundamental building block of all our knowledge is a probabilistic model. The big excitement about quantum computers is that if you take a classical computer and you increase the number of bits, from 8 bits to 16 bits to 32 bits to 64 bits, the performance of a classical computer rises linearly with the number of bits. The excitement about quantum computing is that the performance of a quantum computer arises exponentially with the number of qubits. So you actually only need about 100 qubits to be able to do calculations that no classical computer can perform at the same speed or at all in the history of the universe. So that is the great excitement about it. The problem is adding another qubits to the number of qubits that you have already is also getting exponentially more difficult. And one of the most exciting investments that I have is a very unexpected investment called Parity QC, which is a spin-out of the University of Innsbruck, my hometown in Austria. Last thing I expected, it was quantum computing in Innsbruck, but it turned out that I found not one, but 2 of the world's leading quantum computer groups in Innsbruck, my local capital of the Tyrol. The one is very famous for its experimental ion traps, and it has one of the world records of highly entangled qubits there with Rainer Platt. And the other one is the theoretical group under Peter Zoller. And a number of the quantum computers that are now on the web, like the first quantum computer ever to be on the web, is the IBM quantum computer, and that's a Peter Zoller architecture. Now, he had a young professor called Wolfgang Lechner, who I've been supporting through his professorship, and we managed to get this spin out because he had an amazing, unexpected breakthrough, a theoretical breakthrough, that showed that this exponential entangling that you need to have in order to get that exponential growth of n qubits, where n by n qubits are all entangled to give you that performance, is equivalent to having n squared qubits, so you've got rather more qubits, but they only need to be entangled to the nearest 4 neighbors, so it becomes scalable. So it's a very exciting development. So what are these quantum computers good for? Why do we have this excitement about them? Well, one is the spooks are all in a dizzy, because with the Shor's algorithm, you can crack all the existing codes. So if we do have quantum computers in 5 years' time, we will have, sorry, I'll just have to, can you please call back later? I'm on a presentation. So the codes, any encryption that you have at the moment, if you believe that we'll have these quantum computers in 5 years' time, will be decoded in 5 years' time. So I think it's very important that we're changing our coding system at the moment to make sure that that doesn't happen. Probably one of the most exciting aspects of quantum computing is, as Richard Feynman proposed some years ago, if you have a quantum system like molecules, why would you want to use a classical computer to model it? So the right way to model molecular interactions, atomic interactions, is through quantum computers. And the long-term vision there is that you might do drug trials in silicon. the European lead that we've enjoyed for some years in quantum computing is quickly disappearing if we're not careful, because the US and China are just outspending us. You know, the minute it became clear that quantum computers will succeed, which was about 5 years ago, when physicists realized this is going to work, the Americans, Google, Microsoft, IBM, managed to put hundreds of millions into projects to push this forward. So America has this, you know, wonderful venture capital and big company firepower to do this. China has a similar firepower, but government supported, and we're just watching how the other two big guys are doing it. Now we're finally getting our act together. There is a European flagship of $1 billion. Germany is spending $2 billion. The UK is now spending $1 billion on it. So I don't think the situation is hopeless. I think we have a chance of playing our proper role in the quantum computing world. But we do need to deploy the resources, both in terms of the intellectual resources, which we clearly have in European universities. We're just as good as the US and China, although China, of course, is growing exponentially just because of the number of people that they have there. We just need the money behind it, which brings me to the next point. Next slide, please. That the problem that we have in Europe is actually not startups. We produce more startups than the US, little known fact. We have a problem with scale-ups. We just grow these companies. We don't grow these companies fast enough. And I'm delighted that I was asked by the European Commission to chair the advisory board for the European Innovation Council, which I'm pleased to tell you had its founding meeting yesterday. So we now have a European Innovation Council fund, which is the start of a $10 billion initiative that will start on the 1st of January 2021, but we're already running a pilot this year. If I could have the next slide, please. This year, I think we spent 800 million or $1 billion on supporting European innovation through two very simple awards. One is grants through our Pathfinder system that are grants for deep technology, breakthrough technology startups up to 2.5 million euros. And then for the first time in the history of the EU, we can make equity investments in deep technology companies as well, up to the tune of 15 million euros. But the thing that I was very insistent on, and I'm delighted the EU has adopted, is that we only spend up to 15 million as a catalytic amount of money to crowd in the market. So not to crowd out the market and do it instead of VCs, but only invest if most of the market actually, most of the money actually comes from the venture capital community in Europe. And then the EIC, the European Innovation Council, acts as a catalyst to make sure that these investments actually do happen, and they happen at a scale that can rival the early stage investments that we have in the US, which sometimes is up to 50 million. So if the EIC can provide 15 million and there is a 2 to 3 times leverage effect from the market, then we might get these 50 million chunks together in early stage companies to make them competitive with the US and China. Next slide, please. So, which brings me to the role of government. A few years ago, I contributed with David Sainsbury on a report that I think is still very topical, called The Race to the Top. The only game in town for Western democracies really is to build on its innovation capability, on its research capability, and make sure that this research is translated efficiently into companies that can move the needle for Europe. And one of the dangers is that we see both in AI with DeepMind and in the quantum computer initiatives of Google and Microsoft and so on, is that some of the best research is actually now done in companies, no longer in universities. We also need good regulation, as we've seen with gene synthesis, and we need this pump priming. We just need governments to be supportive of innovation in Europe, lest the US and China just completely defeat us in breakthrough technologies. And we want to crowd in the market that way. One of the visions that as you've gathered by now, I'm a passionate European. I'm a great believer in Europe because I'm so proud that Europe is the only region in the world that has managed to create a layer above the nation state, which sort of works, which all its flaws and it needs improving and reform, etc. But it does work. There is a euro. There are lots of initiatives that 27 nations have managed to agree on, and I'm of course very upset that Britain is leaving the European Union. So next slide. I think I'm coming to the end of my talk, and we can then go to the discussion and answering your questions. So my vision for Europe is in many ways that we can be the third way. We can be the honest go-between the US and China, because in my opinion, the US stresses the individual too much. And we've got this problem with staggering inequalities in US society, partially brought about by this unfortunate lobbying system that has become a very unsavory aspect of the American democracy. China, in my opinion, stresses society too much. So with their party system, it's all about the party and society, and the individual isn't worth much. Whereas in Europe, we have a reasonable balance, with our socialism that is in between the US and China. And I think we ought to be able to play this mediating role. And with the European Union, we've got a shining example of, in my sort of positive mood, that could act as a template of how we finally can have, a world united in a number of issues like climate change, etc. I just wanted to remind you that, in my opinion, there are 4 key innovations which we need to get right over the next 5 to 10 years, because they will have such an impact on our lives. They are AI and machine learning, blockchain and smart contracts, synthetic biology and quantum computing. And we need to be bold and make these big bets in the billions, not just a million here and a million there. And that's why I'm excited about the 10 billion euro initiative from the European Innovation Council. But the governments have to play their roles, and I very much hope, of course, that the UK will stay part of Horizon Europe, of which the EIC is a part, and become an associate member. Whenever I talk to any of the universities or the Royal Society, there is tremendous support for that. When I talk to anybody in Brussels, they're very keen to have Britain in, but there are sort of dogmatic aspects of the UK government at the moment that is heading for hard Brexit, which I hope is not going to happen. So on this cheery note, I'd like to open it up to questions.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Hermann, for that really sort of fascinating overview of so many different facets of the tech industry and where it's going. Obviously, loads and loads of questions coming in, picking up on lots and lots of the things that you've been talking about. The first one that we're going to go for here is one about regulation. And this comes from Josh, who's doing physics at Oxford. And Josh asks, you spoke about needing good regulation. How do you think governments should practically approach the problem of splitting up large tech companies?
Well, that's a very good question. Since we don't have any, it's not really our problem. It's a US problem. And it's the same way that they broke up Standard Oil. There is, there is the legal capability of breaking up. So Google has so many aspects of Google at the moment. There's YouTube, there is the search capability, so you can break those up. Or Facebook, you can break up Facebook between Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram and all the things that they have now combined to build a monopoly situation with a market share that is completely unprecedented. Standard Oil was broken up, I think, when they had a 29% market share. So, America has just taken its eye off the ball here.
Okay, question here about the impacts of the current pandemic, particularly to do with AI. So this comes from Phoebe, who's doing history at Cambridge. And Phoebe asks, how has the current pandemic impacted the development of AI? Will it accelerate the fourth industrial revolution as companies look to replace human employees in retail, etc.?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I've never thought about that, replacing humans in retail, but you're absolutely right. There are more and more capabilities that we get with AI machines. I don't think retail is necessarily, well, there are, I'm sure you've heard about the Amazon shops, the physical Amazon shops that exist, where you can cart, you walk through the shop, you put things in the cart, and you walk out. And because there are cameras that watch you put the cereal into your cart, it knows how much a cereal costs and will charge you for it. So yes, there is automation everywhere. And this the general point that you make, that AI and machine learning will replace many of the existing jobs, of course, is absolutely true. So, and I get asked this question many times. So there are two aspects, or two data points that I can provide for that. One is the historic fact that whenever we develop new technologies, we created more new jobs than we destroyed old jobs. So this is the good news. But it might be different this time. History doesn't always repeat itself. But the other aspect that I think is a pretty solid prediction is that with the replacement of many of the human jobs, if they're done by machines, that means that we get quite an impressive productivity increase. So we don't have a problem that we make people poor. We've got a problem of income distribution to make sure that the money is more evenly distributed in society, which is actually not so much of a problem in Europe. The main complaint is about the very uneven distribution of wealth in the United States and some countries like Mexico, etc. So we've got to make sure that in a sort of socialist system, as we do have in Europe, we make sure that those people who become redundant get opportunities in the labor market, maybe working fewer hours, but also working in jobs that are more creative, like theater or music or childcare or care for the elderly. There's always lots of things to do in the society, and we'll certainly have the money. We'll be rich enough to do this if we allow AI to increase our productivity. So this is my 10 cents worth of thoughts on that one.
Great. Question here about overseas acquisitions of important companies. I guess this is picking up on SoftBank's acquisition of Arm. This is coming from Rahul, doing medicine at Imperial. And Rahul asks, do you think there should be restrictions on strategically important British companies being purchased by overseas investors?
Yes, I do. And I, for one, voted against my shareholding was so small it didn't make any difference anymore, that I voted against the Arm acquisition of SoftBank. And SoftBank has indeed done what they said they would do. They have they've invested more money in ARM. ARM has grown substantially in Cambridge and all over the world. But the decisions, of course, are now made in Japan and not in the UK or another European country. And ARM has become the dominant microprocessor in the world. If you look at the numbers, we've now sold over 120 billion microprocessors, since there are 7 billion people on Earth. So every one of you has more than 10 or soon more than 20 microprocessors on you. And you might ask, well, where are my 20? And the answer is in your iPhone or your smartphone, because it's not just the application processor, it's the processor in the Wi-Fi, the processor in the USB, the processor that does the touch processing on your touch screen, etc., etc. So it is quite a strategic and important company. It's one of the very few globally relevant companies that we have in Europe. And the final decisions are now no longer made in Europe. So I think I'm in favor of having restrictions on foreign purchases.
Question here about, I suppose, the general growth of the British tech industry, but it uses a similar example. Coming here from Jin, who's doing law at KCL. And Jin asks, with venture capital and foreign investment in the British tech industry reaching an all-time high pre-crisis, what do you think needs to be done to maintain this growth post-COVID?
It's a very good question, and I think lots of people who are a lot smarter than me are scratching their heads about this, because we are going to have a recession, a very dramatic recession this year all over the world, maybe with the exception of China. And fortunately, venture capital tends to be counter-cyclical. I mean, the good news is that actually now is one of the best times to start a new company, especially an innovative company, a deep tech company. Because if you look back in history, many of the greatest companies were founded during a period of crisis. And during a period of crisis, as we now have with the COVID-induced economic crisis, venture capital is still there, because venture capital has these very long time horizons. You know, we've got 10-year funds, and often they get extended to 12 or 14 years. So we're not so sensitive to quarterly earnings as the stock market is. So I hope we'll be able to, create a number of great companies during this crisis, during later this year and early next year. But it's going to be tough because it's unprecedented. We've never had a crisis that was quite as serious as COVID.
Another question about the general British tech industry, although this time to do how this relates to Brexit. This is coming from Alex, who's doing economics at UCL. And Alex asks, how much of a positive or negative impact do you think Brexit will have on the British tech landscape? Will it remain first in Europe, or can hubs in Berlin or Paris, etc., catch up?
Well, I think it will have a negative effect, because anything that impedes the international collaboration between tech companies is bad news. Having said that, Britain clearly is leading Europe in technology. Britain has the most venture capital. Britain has the most high-tech successes, including ARM and many exciting software companies in London, and fintech companies. And my feeling is Britain will probably be able to retain this lead, but the distance between Britain and Germany and France will diminish. So if you look at the growth rates of the high-tech community in Berlin and Paris, these growth rates are much higher than the British growth rates at the moment, but from a much lower base. So I think there will be an equaling out of the tech community across Europe, and even in my native Austria, which was the slowest in the developing a high-tech industry. I'm pleased to tell you that it now has one of the highest growth rates from one of the lowest positions in Europe. So it is catching on, and but I think Britain has a fair chance of staying ahead.
Question here coming in about UBI from Anna, who's doing PPE at LSE. Anna says, you spoke about income distribution. What are your thoughts on the potential of universal basic income, UBI? It has been gaining more mainstream attention in the light of the pandemic.
Yes, it has. And as you know, there are a number of interesting experiments, notably the one in Finland and the one in Kenya, which is very long-term. It's a 20-year project, I believe. But the results that have come out so far are not overwhelming. So I think it's an interesting experiment which should be watched. I think the worry that I have about UBI is that it solves the economic issue, that people don't fall out at the bottom, you know, the homelessness and all that. And that's, of course, a good thing. That's, you know, a social equivalent to the social safety net. But it doesn't solve the problem of integrating people into a meaningful contribution to society. So, you know, some people argue you don't need that. They will self-organize. They will do it themselves. But if you show some leadership on how people can make meaningful contributions and therefore get a meaning in their lives, I think that's probably a more fruitful way of making sure that that the lower income classes become or stay an integral part of our society.
Okay, question here about the European Union as a whole, I suppose, from Johan, who's doing economics at Harvard. And Johan asks, you mentioned that the European Union kind of works. What does it need to do to ensure that it can continue to do so without further disintegration?
Well, on the further disintegration, in fact, one of the best things that happened to Europe, of course, was Brexit. If you know, there's been a recent opinion poll across Europe, and the support for Europe has never been higher. So they're typically in the 60 to 70% across Europe now, because they all feel that you know, they're all so sad that Britain is leaving. And you know, whether people are right or not, they all feel that it will be very detrimental to the UK. Only time will tell. It's very difficult to predict what will actually happen. But there is a newfound, you know, excitement about the European idea, despite all the problems that it has. Because in a way, it's the only game in town for Europe. Because only a united Europe has any chance of negotiating with the US and China. It's one of those sad things about Britain. I mean, you know, Britain has become, you know, has moved from an important nation to, I think it's now number 7 behind France and India, and will soon fall further down the ranking, and will become, you know, not a very important country in the world. In the World League. So the only game in town is for us to play a global role is, in my opinion, is Europe. And then, you know, I'm biased. I'm a passionate European.
Okay, question here about global standards for innovation, coming from Matthias, who's doing modern languages at Oxford. Matthias asks, with American tech firms maintaining their world-leading status, at least relative to Europe, I suppose, do you believe the US narrative that their country is naturally the most conducive to innovation?
It is at the moment. I think there is no doubt about it. And but interestingly, it's not at the beginning of the innovation. As I said, there are more startups in Europe than in the US. The thing that the US and China one also must say, has figured out is when there is this bubbling up of you know, exciting, innovative ideas, the US has figured out how to put enough money behind these ideas very early on in order to make them global leaders. And China is doing this impressively with one of the things that I know a little bit about is the semiconductor industry. The U.S. policy of that they have with respect to Huawei and the other semiconductor companies in China, in my opinion, is completely self-defeating, because although it clearly will hurt China short term, it will force China into building their own solutions for everything, which will then beat the US at their own game, because they were forced to do it, whereas they would have been very happy to continue buying from the US and having a more collaborative environment. But and that's where Europe could be the honest go-between to make sure that they don't fall out too much. Anybody who is interested in going into more detail here in the historic aspects of China versus the US should read Destined for War by Graham Allison, a Kennedy School professor who wrote this brilliant book where he actually coined the phrase the Thucydides trap. Thucydides, if you remember, was the journalists that reported on the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. And Sparta was the incumbent, and Athens was the up-and-coming city-state, and they had a war, and it was, of course, terrible for Greece at the time. And he then studied whether a similar situation has arisen over the last 500 years, and he found 16 such cases, 12 of which ended in war. The 4 that didn't, one of the most interesting one was when the US took over from Britain in the late 19th century during the period of Theodore Roosevelt. And that didn't end in war. And there were 2 reasons that he quotes in his book why it didn't. One was a big debate in the House of Lords with the admiral of the British fleet that dominated the waves, that ruled the waves in those days. And they said, we've got to show those colonists, who is who. And the admiral said, yeah, we can pick a fight with the Americans and have a war with them, but we're going to lose. So what happened is that the minute Theodore Roosevelt realized he had more ships and more firepower in the Caribbean, he told the Brits to bug off. He has this lovely teddy bear image, but he was a real ship. he flexed his muscle, and there were the Brits were trying to collect some debt from Venezuela. And as usual, the Brits would send in the gunboats and say, pay up. And Theodore Roosevelt said, no. This is on my patch. This will go to arbitration. And the outcome of the arbitration will be what I say. And I see an analogy here with China, of course. So the book is all about, will there be a war between China and the US? And it's clear that China is building up enormous power in the South China Sea. And I think exactly the same thing is going to happen there. The minute China has more firepower in the South China Sea, they will tell the Americans to bug off. Because this is our thing. So it's just a repeat. And I hope that America will then gracefully retreat to the other side of the Pacific and say, well, okay, let's not have a war. Let's talk a little more. But it's an issue. Yeah. So I betrayed the next one, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, next question follows on from that quite interestingly. It's about essentially about the rise of China. This coming from Sam, who's doing a PhD in management at Cambridge. And Sam asks, might the digital yuan challenge US dollar hegemony as a global trade currency, especially if they leverage the One Belt, One Road initiative to gain adoption?
Yes.
Okay. Next question here from Raman, doing chemistry at Imperial. Actually, to an extent, also talking about similar topic. And so Raman says, how long do you think it will be before equivalents of universal apps like WeChat with WeChat Pay, etc., will take hold in the West? Will it remain unique to China?
Well, it's not unique to China. If you look at all the tourist spots around the world, and the previous question about the Belt and Road Initiative was a very good one, is because Chinese tourism is the main tourist spender in the world now. They all want to pay with WeChat. So if you go to the tourist spots in London, you can pay with WeChat. And I know this very well as an Austrian because I grew up in the Tyrol, where we are a very touristy area. And before the euro, of course, all the Germans were coming in and trying to pay with Deutschmark. So there were areas in the Tyrol that was basically a Deutschmark enclave, where everybody would use Deutschmark because the Germans wanted to use the Deutschmark. And so it will be with the yuan, because it will be a very efficient way. It will not only be for Chinese tourists, but because the first digital currency has a phenomenal first mover advantage, because the advantages of an e-currency are just phenomenal. It is instant settlement. So when you pay something, the guy actually has it in his bank account a few seconds later. It's totally international, so anywhere in the world. So it solves the problem of the poor Pakistanis in the UAE, for example. One of the scandals of our financial system is that when the Pakistani laborer sends $100 back to his family in Pakistan, they pay $5 to $10 for the privilege to transfer $100. It's a total scandal and hits the lowest income people. Now, if you replace that with an yuan, the transfer cost is exactly zero. So clearly, it's instant. So his family will get it a few seconds later, and he doesn't pay anything or an absolute minimal amount for it. So this makes it so attractive. So the first credible digital currency in the world, which at the moment is the yuan, I think has a phenomenal first mover advantage. The biggest disadvantage of the yuan, of course, is that it's a non-convertible currency at the moment. But as the previous person mentioned, with the Road and Belt Initiative, they will be able to have a phenomenal way of distributing the yuan through most of the growing world. Because what people often forget, there's another wonderful book called Fact Matters by Hans Rosing, where he says that the world has a PIN number, and the PIN number is 1114. 1 billion Americans, 1 billion Europeans, 1 billion Africans, and 4 billion Asians. So the future belongs to Asia, and China is going to be the top nation. So we better get used to it. So this, this issue that the Americans have, they don't want to give up their number one spot, and they're playing a bit like a child throwing out her toys from the pram, rather than having the only sensible policy that they should have, which is, since there are three main blocks in the world, the US, the EU, and China, if any two of them get together, they make the rules. So the natural thing for us to do is for the US and Europe to get together and say, these are the conditions, these are our values, these are the conditions under which we will work with China. And we can do this. We can make the rules. And unfortunately, the US has a president that picks a fight with everybody, and in particular, his favorite fights are apparently with his friends. I mean, Europe is a natural ally of the US, and he's pissed off all European countries so much that, and he is incapable of making any compromise with anybody. So let's just hope he gets defeated in November, and we have an opportunity of working with the US again.
Great. Question now about AI and how you can incorporate that into your career, from Gautam, who's doing medicine at Oxford. And Gautam asks, do you have any advice for someone of a medical, not computer science background who is captivated by AI and looking to incorporate it into their career path?
Yes, one of the nice things about AI, although AI has this reputation of being incredibly difficult and very mathematical, there's been so much development in AI and the AI environment that has that we now have applications and ways of using AI by people who are not computer experts. So, and in the medical profession in particular, I would strongly recommend that you talk to people that have, or companies that provide these AI environments, because normal mortals can use them just as well as the experts now.
Quite a philosophical question about AI here, coming from Helen, who's doing philosophy at Edinburgh. And Helen asks, if a fully functioning replica of a human being could be made in robot form, ought it to be given full human rights? For example, Sophia the robot was recently given Saudi citizenship.
Yes, that was a bit of a PR stunt. So it's a good question, and I don't really have a good answer, other than it is clear that because we're going to gain control of our bodies as well, as I mentioned in the part of my presentation on synthetic biology, the borders between sort of software AI that sort of lives in the computer and AI that lives in its biological instantiation are going to get blurred. So all these issues on who ought to have rights and what the rights are will be a question for us to sort out in discussions that will follow the rise of AI into more responsible decisions. Now, the first thing that we see, of course, is that will affect us. In fact, is infecting us now. I drove down to Auckland yesterday in my Tesla, and for most of the trip, I had it on auto steer, which the car was driving itself. I was just holding the steering wheel, but it steered itself. So then the question is, if I had produced an accident this way, is it me or is it the software that made that decision? And it's a very interesting and vexing question that first comes to the fore with autonomous driving, which of course is getting better every year. And I think within 5 years we'll probably have some cars without steering wheels, so we'll just get in there and tell the car where to go. So these questions are becoming more and more relevant. I think people sort of probably don't mind having good self-driving cars because, apart from us all aging boy racers, what's the big deal about driving a car as long as it's safe and gets me from A to B? What's not to like about that? But when it gets to higher and higher echelons of decision making, that might not be the case.
Okay, quite a nice question here actually from Matt, who's doing engineering at MIT, and Matt says, "Thanks so much for speaking to us today and for being a real pioneer in technology and science. Which of your many inspiring achievements are you most proud of in your career?"
Well, two things that I'm most proud of is probably number one, the BBC Micro, because although we in the whole history of computing, I think we produced maybe a few million, maybe 3 or 4 million computers. These computers were the standard computer in British schools, and led to the education of a whole generation of software programmers. And that is the reason why Britain has one of the leading set of games developers in the world. It's mainly because they all learned how to program on the BBC Micros in schools. So out of all of them, that's probably my proudest achievement, that I managed to contribute to a whole generation of software programmers in a country. And the second one is the ARM. That practically 100% of the smartphones in the world are powered by an ARM is an unusual achievement that I'm proud of.
Great. Here's a question more broadly just about AI from Katie, who did PP at Oxford. And Katie asks, which areas of business and life do you think AI will impact the most?
Healthcare is my opinion, because what AI is particularly good at is to deal with very, very complex systems where our brain is just not big enough to get and there are no easy formulas. I mean, one of the nice things about physics is, we basically have two formulae. One is the Schrödinger equation, and the other is general relativity, and that's it. Everything else is just derivations from these formulae. And there is no life formula. There is no biological formula. I mean, in the end, it's all based on Schrödinger's equation anyway. But the Schrödinger equation doesn't really help you to make decisions on whether you buy a carrot in a supermarket or a tomato. So, or in healthcare, whether how you're going to treat your patient. But what machine learning and AI is very good at is to take a large data set of many diseases, many instances of diseases, many different people, many different persons that differ in their genetic setup, and learn and tease out the patterns that appear by looking at the data. And the progress that is being made, especially in diagnostics, for example, on using machine learning, we now have machine learning techniques that are much better at spotting early cancer tumors, for example, in X-ray pictures. And with machine learning, they're now better than the best X-ray doctors. And if you ask the X-ray radiologists whether they're worried about AI, the answer is no, not at all. We're delighted with it, because that's the boring part of my job. The important part of my job is, once I know that a patient has a particular problem, a particular tumor, is then think about the way to talk to the patient about it, to select a good treatment, etc. So it actually makes them more productive. And I think there will be many more examples of that in healthcare. So if I was to guess as to the biggest impact for society that it will have is in healthcare, although short term, I suppose autonomous driving would be one that will have a big impact on society.
Great. Growing conscious of your time here, which you've been so generous with so far. So just thinking, last couple of questions. That's all right. Here's one from Klaus, who's reading Natsky at Cambridge. And Klaus asks, in light of tech billionaires becoming more and more wealthy, do you think governments should take more action to prevent individuals accruing too much wealth?
No, I think the system of tech billionaires, if they actually get it by taking the risk, building up their companies, and becoming very rich, is a very good incentive for other people to do it as well. When they become very rich, you need to tax them. One of the failures of the US system is, again, because of the lobbying system. I mean, it takes a couple of billion to become a president in the United States, and millions to become a senator or representative. And if you look at where that money is coming from, it is, of course, coming from people like the big companies, and a lot also from very rich individuals. Some of them in a sort of philanthropic way, but many of them, just want to protect the phenomenal tax privileges that they have. So, if you have accumulated billions, then although there are people like Bill Gates who, of course, produce, have one of the great philanthropists in the world. The question, and that's very good. And sometimes you need individuals to be able to make these big decisions and spend hundreds of millions on malaria, as Bill has done. But some of that money should also be recycled via the government back to people who are less fortunate than them. And Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate, has a very clear design of the type of taxation system that you need to deal with these discrepancies.
Great. Another career-related question coming from Jack, who's reading philosophy at Cambridge. And Jack asks, what area of technology do you think will be the most important and impactful for a young person coming out of university to become involved with?
Well, it's really these four areas that I talked about, AI and machine learning, because it's so horizontal, it really touches everything. And again, as I said a little earlier, in answer to the question about medicine, AI is now becoming a tool that's really available to anybody who cares to read up about it and use it. For our own lives, synthetic biology, I think, which will have that effect on healthcare, will probably be the most important and most impactful technology. But if you think about the structure of our financial system, again, it's part of society, like with the e-currency, then the blockchain, the digital currencies might have the biggest impact. And if you're just a geek like me and like really powerful computers, then quantum computing, when it finally appears, of course, will again be one of those horizontal technologies that will accelerate AI, accelerate synthetic biology, and accelerate the blockchain. So you can argue, well, quantum computing is really the most fundamental, so that you ought to get involved in that. But that's still pretty tricky. I'm just really brushing up on my quantum mechanics, and it's a lot of work.
Yeah, slightly similar question here, but more looking at it from the perspective of a startup. Coming from Milad, who's doing maths at Warwick. And Milad asks, as a venture capital investor, which areas do you think a UK or European-based startup could become a market-leading disruptive innovator in? Also, which sectors are you keeping an eye on most?
Well, one of the positive aspects, despite the anti-globalization that we have at the moment, the world will become more global and more interactive, although some of the excesses of globalization, of course, we ought to deal with. But the good news is that you now can you can create a startup pretty much anywhere in the world with a good educational system, a good internet access, and a bit of a local support network, and venture capital. So really, the world is your oyster. And I see you're reading maths, which when people ask me, especially young people, what they should do, is my first question is always mathematics, because it's the bit that it's one of the few things that you best learn when you're young. It's harder when you get older, and it's one of those fundamental technologies that will then help you in any subject. And the sector, the sector answer is again the answer that I've provided already in the four technologies that I mentioned earlier. And I keep my eye on all four of them, and I've got investments in all four of them. And it's just a very exciting time, because all four of them are developing very rapidly at the moment.
Great. Here's a question about book recommendations from Olivia, who's reading biology at Oxford. Olivia says, "Thank you so much for this amazing talk. Given we have more free time right now, do you have any book recommendations to further explore some of the ideas discussed here?"
Well, I've already given you three. Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark, if you're interested in biology, in the sort of long-term aspects of biology. Destined for War by Graham Allison on the China-US thing, and The Great Reversal by Thomas Philippon on the US, the problems that the US is creating itself by the lobbying system, allowing American companies to merge to such an extent that you end up with a small monopoly that then makes America uncompetitive, actually, and the reason why Europe, at least in that respect, is more competitive. And then there is what's the Hans Rovsing book called? Not factuality, of something with facts. Well, I have it here somewhere. I can't lay my hands on it. That's a wonderful book. So Hans Rovsing, look up Hans Rovsing. He's a Swede that just said, let's look at the facts. One of the great advantages that we now have is that we've got access to databases, very easy access, like with the Corona database. You know, I look up the different countries every day, and there is a world. It's part of the World Meter site, right? Coronavirus site. That's available to anybody. Anybody can look up how many cases there are in the US, how many new cases are in the UK. Of course, the UK is the only country, or one of the very few countries out of the 200 countries that does not report the number of active cases. You know, it's in many ways, in the Corona case, the UK has behaved like a developing country rather than one of the lead countries in research that it is. It's shameful, and it is very, very disappointing of having such an incompetent government. But there are lots of these databases that we now have free access to, that you can inform yourself, and he just trains people up with this book on how to do this, which databases to go to, and he asks 20 questions at the beginning of the book that you wouldn't, that most people get the wrong answers on, like you know, how many years do girls spend in education on average in the world, and how many boys? And everybody says, well, the boys have got lots more education than the girls, and it's just not so. I think there's 1 year difference. So there are lots of surprising results. The other thing is, you know, we're very worried about the poor. How many poor are there in the world? Well, you know, it's changed dramatically, mainly because of China. So most people in the world are no longer poor. They're sort of in the middle of the distribution. So he has 4 categories of wealth. And we've got 1 billion, and it's still, you know, billion people that are very poor. It's a real problem, but much less than a few years ago. And then most of the people are in this middle section. And then we've got 1 million who are probably far too rich, like all of us.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time. We figured just last question. Of course, we need to get moving on. But yeah, so nice question here from James, doing geography at LSE. And James says, as someone who has become a leader in the tech industry and a source of inspiration to us, I'd love to know who some of your role models were when you were starting out.
Well, that's a very good question. Well, I was very impressed by a number of professors that I had, in particular Walter Thering, my physics teacher at Vienna University, because he had such incredible clarity in explaining, you know, physics to us. He was a theoretical physicist who had just come back from heading up the theory section at CERN in Geneva. He's a wonderful person. And then at Cambridge, you know, there were a number of very inspiring professors there, because, you know, I'm a little bit of a geek, so I look up at them. People like John Conway, who was one of the great British mathematicians who sadly died in April this year of corona. He was the guy who invented the the game of life, and I actually first met him in the Graduate Center in Cambridge when he had a 10th order cartwheel under his arm, and the 10th order cartwheel is a structure in the fivefold symmetric tiling of the plane. And we just talked about these Penrose tiles, and it was just very inspiring to talk to somebody. And there was another book. It's called ONAG, On Numbers and Games, by John Horton Conway. Just absolutely wonderful book on how you create numbers out of nothing. That's one of the most inspiring examples. You get the natural numbers, the rational numbers, and the real numbers by just a very, very simple formula. That's and all the cardinals and ordinals. Really extraordinary.
Well, thank you very much again, Dr. Hauser, for sharing so much of your time and your fascinating insights and advice with us. Thank you also to everyone who's been watching for all your varied and challenging questions. We look forward to welcoming you all again soon at our upcoming events. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.